In a previous screencast, I showed you how we can export data from Excel files into text files, TXT files. In this screencast, I'm going to show you how you can import data from text files into Excel. The first part, I'm going to create a phrase in a text file, and we're going to import that single string. So to make your own text files, you can go into the notepad, and I just search here, and we open up the notepad, and I'm just going to type in a string here, and then I can save that string as a .txt file on the desktop. So I'm going to call that import file, and it's going to be named a .txt file. So that's my import file. Now let me just show you what we're going to be creating. We're going to be creating this subroutine that asks the user to navigate to the file. So that was my import file, and then it's going to go through and it's going to output that in a message box. In the second example I'm going to show you, we've got in a previous screencast I showed you how we can export a vector of items in Excel to a text file. So we had this example where we had the 7 dwarfs as separate lines. We're going to use this then as a basis, and we're going to import this output example. So the second part of the screencast, I'm going to show you how to import text files that have multiple lines of data. So let's use our output example. So this is what we created in the previous screencast. We're going to open that, and it's going to then take in those items that were in the text file and import them into our spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to make a simple sub called import text. I've dimmed file name as string, S as string, so file name is going to be the name of the file that the user navigates to. S is going to be the string that's contained within that first line of the text file. Next, we're going to use the getOpenFileName application, as we did in a previous screencast, to open up a text file that the user navigates to, and then we're going to open up that workbook. Now, when I'm working through multiple workbooks, I don't think it's necessary in this case, but I like to, a lot of times you can get confused between what's known as the active workbook, which is the one that you just opened. So once we open up this file name workbook, that's going to be the active workbook. This workbook is always the workbook that is that this code, the VBA code, is in. So what I like to do is I like to dim 2 new variables, TWB and AWB for this workbook and active workbook. So I've got TWB, this workbook, and AWB, that's going to be the active workbook, as workbooks. Those are just another type of data type that you can dim variables as. So we can use set TWB as this workbook, and it'll remember this file name that this code is in. And actually that is supposed to be an equal sign here. So set TWB equal this workbook. After we open up the workbook that the user navigates to, we're going to set AWB, that's going to be the active cell, as the active workbook. So at this point, let me show you what's going to happen. So we go through this, we set this workbook, TWB equal to this workbook. So if you look down here in the locals window, if you look down here into the full name, that's this workbook. So that's the workbook, the path for this workbook. Then we're going to have the user define where we're going to import the data, and I'm going to import the data from the output of the previous screencast, our 7 dwarfs. So we do that, and what has happened is we have opened up then a new Excel spreadsheet, and this is basically the text file being converted to an Excel spreadsheet. So if I open this up, you see that we've imported then into our new file. So this is a separate file. This is the active workbook now, and we've got in cells A1 through A7, we've got the data that were in the original text file. So again, AWB is that workbook that the text file, we converted it into a workbook, and that's what we're working with now. So that's the active workbook. The next step is to count. I'm going to use the count A function in Excel to just count the number of columns in our active workbook, which again is this file. So that'll tell us the number of items in there that are not blank. So we have 7. That's another way to count the number of rows. Instead of dimming s here as a string, I'm going to make this a vector, because it's going to contain the components in our text file, the different lines. So now s is going to be a string of unknown size at the beginning. Once we know the size, the number of rows, I can re-dim s of size nr as a string. So it's going to be a vector of strings. When I'm working with vectors, I like to use option base 1 up here, so I've added that. And now to populate our s vector, so our s vector is going to represent in our active workbook here that corresponds to our text file. S is going to represent all the items of column A here. So I'm going to implement a for loop. We're going to go from I equals the number of rows. The ith element of S is just going to be range A and I, so we concatenate A with I. So the first one is just going to be cell A1, cell A2, and so on. So we're going to this for loop populates S with the items then in our active workbook, which is this. And now I'm going to do two things. The first one is we're going to close the active workbook. So that's the workbook that was converted from a text file to a workbook. We're closing that. We're going to not save any changes. So you can do save changes : false. And again, this isn't really necessary, but I like to do it because if you have other workbooks open, sometimes you can get confused and you'll accidentally paste or output stuff into the wrong workbook. So then I like to activate that workbook. And finally, to output, now there's multiple ways to do this, but the one that I'm just showing here is we're going to do range of A1. So we're going to output into that range. You can choose whatever range you want. There's multiple ways to do this, but we're going to go range A1 to a number of rows, that's 7 in this case, equals the transpose, the worksheet function transpose of S. Remember, S vectors are row vectors, so if you want to make them column vectors, you have to transpose. So let's go ahead and do this. Like I was saying in a previous screencast, sometimes when you use these different types of applications, then in debug mode, it just kind of goes to the end. So I'm going to put a couple of breakpoints in here, and I'm going to go ahead and press F8. We need to define an R and I guess. I forgot to do that. So I've dimmed those variables, and let's see if there's anything else I forgot. So we're going to set this workbook to this workbook. We open up this to choose our file that we want to import, and see how it just skipped to the next breakpoint. I don't know why it does that, but anyway, we counted the number of rows. We redimmed S then as a size 7, and now we're going to import into our S vector all of the elements. You notice that here I've got this, this is our text file that's been converted to an Excel file, and we're importing those names down here in the locals window, and I can run through the last two of these, and then we're going to close the workbook, not saving any changes. We're going to activate this workbook, and then what we're going to do is in range A1 to A7, we're going to output the data. So we can go back to the original spreadsheet, and we've output that. So you can change where you want to place that with changing the range here. And you can also have the user select that in some more advanced features. But this is how you can then import data from a text file into Excel.